Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started because I want to value everybody's time. Excuse me, I'm a little hoarse this evening. Um, but good evening to everybody who has made it in so far. I am Guy Moody still, ruling elder at St. John United in Columbia, Maryland, and co-chair of the Presbytery of Baltimore's Dismantling Racism team, along with Sharice Jordan Moore, who's a ruling elder at Knox Presbyterian. Sharice cannot be with us tonight as she's in Salt Lake City attending the Presbyterian Mission Agency Board's 3-day meeting. That's the PMA Board's meeting, which just shows what a dynamo that Sharice is and how much she does. And it's just my everyday honor to be working alongside with her when she's back here at home. We are so glad you're with us for this, our 5th and penultimate session in the study of the color of law. Just a quick reminder that we're starting to put some good resources and links on the One Book, One Presbytery webpage, so take a look. I believe it was Tuesday, Frank put up a redlining map where you can get to that map, and I believe look up redline cities and how redlining affected cities all across the country. And then also one other piece of information was given to me just a few minutes ago, speaking of redlining, is that the undesigned, the red line exhibit is, and this is especially for those of you who are joining us from the National Capital Presbytery, but frankly, it's not that far a drive for those of you from the Baltimore Presbytery. If you haven't seen the undesigned, the red line exhibition somewhere, it's now going to be through July 11th at the Cleveland Park Library on Connecticut Avenue Northwest in DC. It is an absolutely amazing exhibit and such an important exhibit to be able to learn more about redlining and get more into the weeds about what redlining has done to perpetuate segregation and to continue to diminish the ability for African Americans to be along the same economic plane as their white counterparts. So it's really a must-see exhibit. And a reminder.
And the link is in the chat.
Okay, good. Thank you, Susan. The also a reminder that that we are doing this study in conjunction with the In the Loop ministry group, which is convened by ruling elder Kenny Elder, who once again will be working with small groups and leading our litany. And as always, our Presbytery Communications Director, Frank Pirelli, will be keeping things on track and flowing through Zoom. Incidentally, last week, a few of us were beamed up as a shout out to Star Trek fans, or at least zoomed up and placed in other groups. This was because attendance was down a bit last week and the groups were a bit too small. So Frank had the unenviable task of trying to juggle things around to even the groups up. If this happens to you tonight, he's going to try to give you an advance warning. But if just somehow you find yourself mid-sentence, all of a sudden, you know, find yourself still talking into another room, it's because we're trying to keep things equal, and it's a tough task for Frank. I don't envy him, so bear with us, and know that you will be in a good group with good leaders no matter what happens. And some of the leaders may get moved as well. So anyway, and speaking of leaders, the other leaders with us tonight to help do this study are in alphabetical order: Ms. Lisa Beecham, who will also be introducing our presenters for tonight, Reverend Hal Bennett, Reverend Dorothy Bolton, Mr. Bobby Hall, Reverend Deborah McCachran, Reverend Ray Mute, Ms. Susan Moody, Ms. Patsy Noir Barocha, Ms. Annette Snyder and Ms. Nzinga Snyder, Mr. Kenny Walker, and the Reverend Michelle Ward and Mr. Chris Watson. Thank you all again for stepping up. Next week, as a reminder, will be the final week of our study. Please read chapters 11 and 12, as well as the short epilogue and the very important but often overlooked appendix of FAQs. If you have read ahead, based on the outline on the webpage, you might not have read the epilogue and appendix because we initially didn't have them in there. As I've said, they're often overlooked, but we've now put them in there as part of the reading because in this case, that appendix, the epilogue, which is very short, and the appendix are just very important to the book's thesis and what we as the hands and feet of Christ are going to do moving forward. I encourage you all to also really pray about and ponder that self-reflection question posed by Sharice Jordan Moore and James Parks for session 3. I'll remind you that question was, what would it take for you to move from being a passive ally in fighting racism to being a co-conspirator with skin in the game? We will be welcoming Reverend McKenna Llewellyn, pastor of Maryland Presbyterian Church, next week to lead us towards action and what the late John Lewis famously called good trouble. At least as I personally read the scripture, my Lord and Savior Jesus Christ spent his precious short time on earth modeling and demanding good trouble. As his followers, let it be so with us. And with that, I'll turn things over to Elder Kenny Walker to lead us in a responsive litany. Kenny.
Thank you, Guy, and good evening, everyone. Before we start our Dismantling Racism litany, I just want to let you know that I will be assisted with Lisa Beecham from Goldman's Presbyterian Church. I will see racism with spiritual eyes.
Because that is how God sees me.
I will listen with spirit-filled ears.
Because that is how God hears me.
I will speak words of truth and reconciliation.
Because that is how God speaks to me.
I will do what I can to dismantle racism.
Because that is what God wants for his people.
In this struggle,
I will run and not be weary.
In this struggle,
I will walk and never faint.
We can do all things
through Christ who strengthens us.
Thank you. And now I will turn it over to Lisa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kenny. Good evening, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our speakers. And tonight we are fortunate to have two speakers, Reverend Andrew Connors and Mr. Alex Aaron. Reverend Connors is the senior pastor of the Brown Memorial Park Avenue Presbyterian Church in Baltimore, Maryland, a position he has held for the last 20 years. From 2010 to 2021, Andrew served as clergy co-chair for Baltimoreans United in Leadership Development, better known as BUILD, a local affiliate of the Industrial Areas Foundation, and Maryland's largest citizens' power organization. In 2016, Reverend Connors shared a Baltimore Sun Marylander of the Year honorable mention, along with two colleagues for their leadership in negotiating the largest community benefits agreement in Baltimore history. Reverend Connors attended Duke University as a BN Duke Scholar, where he received a BA in history with a focus on contemporary social movements. And he holds a Master of Divinity from Columbia Theological Seminary in Decatur, Georgia. He was the 2001 recipient of the prestigious David H.C. Reed Preaching Award and has preached at numerous conferences and events around the country. He serves on a number of nonprofit boards and is a frequent contributor to scholarly journals. Mr. Alex Aaron is the founder of Blank Slate Development, which is a Baltimore-based minority-owned real estate development and construction company that specializes in revitalizing vacant historic properties and stabilizing distressed neighborhoods. The company is committed to promoting economic development while preserving the existing community. Blank Slate has developed and sold properties across Baltimore City neighborhoods from Broadway East to Pigtown, from Reservoir Hill to Park Heights. Mr. Aaron is responsible for raising capital, guiding project vision and design, as well as representing the company at community events and meetings. He currently serves as vice chair on the board of directors for Baltimore Community Lending. And he also serves as the co-chair of the BCL Campaign Cabinet, which is the fundraising arm of the institution. Mr. Aaron earned a BBA in finance from Howard University and is currently pursuing his master's in real estate and infrastructure from the Johns Hopkins Carey Business School. And we're extra thankful for him being with us tonight because as he finishes here, he moves on to take a final exam. So please join me in welcoming Reverend Andrew Connors and Mr. Alex Aaron.
Thank you, Lisa. And we'll go ahead and get started. And we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. I want to say a special thank you to Alex for being with me. I met Alex in some of the political work that we were doing together. And I've experienced him as someone who has no problem interrupting people who are speaking in positions of authority when he has something to contribute. And I took a shine to him immediately because of that. And then through an interesting somewhat coincidence, ended up baptizing his beautiful children. So we have a wonderful connection together. So thank you, Alex, for being here tonight. I'm going to go briefly through the history of some of the segregationist policies as it's impacted locally in Baltimore. Shift to talk a little bit about the current impact as it involves the problem of vacancy in Baltimore and the real toehold that I believe and the BUILD organization believes that gives us in order to repair some long-standing racist harms that are part of our community. Talk about the current fiscal challenges, then turn it over to Alex because he's a real expert, as you heard, on what it takes to bring repair to many of our communities that have been disinvested from for so long. So with that, let me share my screen here and we will get this going. 1 second. Sorry, flipping screens, and here we go. All right. Okay. Everybody see that all right? Let me move you all to the bottom. There we go. Okay, so you've covered this already, I'm sure, but just a reminder that Baltimore City was the innovator in racial segregation, passing the first housing segregation ordinance directed at Black people in 1911. If you don't know that history, I highly, highly recommend the book Not in My Neighborhood. Antonin Piatillo, who actually used to live in a house right next door to me here in Southwest Baltimore. An incredible book. Also, Lawrence Brown's book on the Black Butterfly. Those two, I think, are required reading as far as I'm concerned for local understanding the local impacts. In the 1930s, you've heard it kicked around already. The FHA institutionalizes redlining. We'll look at some maps in a minute and talk about the impact of those maps and the overlay of those maps on current realities in Baltimore City. And then from the late 1930s on, real estate investors driving blockbusting. So really profiting off of both the racism and the racist policies by encouraging fear in white homeowners to sell their properties, snatching up those properties and then selling them at astronomically high prices to new Black homeowners who are moving into those neighborhoods, and or using these contract buying vehicles that basically cheated Black homeowners often out of their homes over a short amount of time. So that's happening in the 1930s. 1951 and 1971, we have highways, schools, housing projects, displacing people who are disproportionately Black. 80 to 90% of families who are displaced in that period are Black families. I live 5 blocks south of the highway to nowhere. And if you've never driven through the neighborhoods that the highway to nowhere cut through, you should, and you can see how it just put this huge scar right through people's homes. I know some people who won't even drive on that road because they've told me it's like driving over the graves of people. And I know there's an effort currently to think about what would it look like to repair that moving forward. And then as you see at the bottom today, Baltimore neighborhoods that are less than 50% Black receive 4 times the investment of neighborhoods that are 85% Black. So this legacy is not something that is just something that happened in the past. It is an ongoing legacy that we have yet to deal with comprehensively. This is a map of the vacant houses in Baltimore City, which is an odd problem that we'll talk about in a minute. But the blue kind of swatch areas, that is areas where there are very high concentrations of vacant and abandoned homes. West Baltimore, Park Heights, East Baltimore. The little pink dots are more scattered site vacant. So all Baltimore neighborhoods, or nearly all Baltimore neighborhoods, we'll talk about that, have some vacant homes in them. But you can see that this map then overlaid with the redlining maps. And let me just explain this one and then we'll go back and forth. The red lines here are the FHA's redlined maps. The purple is places where blockbusting was rampant in that later period that we discussed. And then these are areas of gentrification, the yellow areas. And I confess, I can't remember what our blue coding was. But I think those 3 segments will be helpful to you. So if you flip back and forth, there's a high correlation between these areas. It's a systemic problem that still hasn't been addressed. This is a map of, I can't remember the current term for food deserts. I don't think we're supposed to call it food deserts, but food insecurity maps. So the red areas are where people don't have healthy food, affordable food to receive. And again, there's some high correlation between all of these maps. And then finally, this is homicides in Baltimore City. This was created on February of 2023, so it's a little bit dated, but you can see, again, the correlations here. If you have read Ibram Kendi's book on anti-racism, his thick book, he takes on many things, but one of them is he calls out the myth of a dangerous Black neighborhood and rightly talks about the reality of a dangerously unemployed neighborhood. So all of these things build on each other, impact on each other, and create the problems that we have today. So I mentioned that vacancy in Baltimore is a very odd problem. And if you look in comparison to some of our East Coast neighbors here, our vacancy rate is 56% higher than the average vacancy rate across East Coast cities. So we are disproportionately affected. I think there's many reasons for that, but one I would point to is just we were the first place in the country to start this mess in the first place, and we have yet to dig ourselves out from it. The other thing I want you to see about vacant houses is that we're talking about chronically vacant properties. So, you know, some communities, when they say a vacant home, they mean something that's been on the market for 3 months and is about to be sold. But as you see, this problem has become chronic for us, meaning that these homes are homes like the ones in this photo with trees growing in the middle of them, boarded up, unstable, that cost our city money in addition to not producing any kind of tax revenue. And I'll kind of skip through this quickly, but this is simply to show that the row house issue creates this problem where vacancy is like a cancer, and it's putting pressure on homes that don't currently have problems. And the upshot of this slide is if you don't take on every single vacant home in a block and fix it, that problem is going to recreate itself. And so one of the things that we've been pushing in our campaign is this understanding of a whole block strategy that addresses every single vacant home in a strategic way as you move forward to rehabilitate a neighborhood. So 41% of all rehab vacant buildings are at risk of becoming vacant again, which calls for a systemic, coordinated strategy to attack this problem at its roots, and in so doing, restore the wealth that has been stolen from Black families who have bought into the American dream in these neighborhoods, and have had their equity completely sucked dry from them, by virtue of this ongoing problem, which itself is rooted in our segregationist history. I think because I want to get to hearing from Alex, I'm going to skip over this a little bit. So I just want you to, I'm going to skip forward to a slide that shows that we basically have 70,000 properties that are either vacant. The VBN is simply means vacant building notice, something that the city has officially designated as a vacant/abandoned home. 21,000 vacant lots and 35,000 properties that are at risk of becoming vacant. So it's an enormous problem. And if you don't address it at its roots, it continues to recur. So that's the point of this slide. The last thing I want to say, and then Alex, I know this is a whirlwind. I'm going to hand it over to you to clean up with your experience and understanding. But this slide is to show that there is a direct correlation between the vacancy rate in a neighborhood and the price of properties. And I'll explain why that's important and why that directly results to restoring the wealth of Black families in the city whose neighborhoods have been disinvested from intentionally by virtue of the federal government's 1930 actions, by virtue of the block busing work, by virtue of the highways that have been put through Black neighborhoods, et cetera, et cetera. It's very important to understand this financing piece, because if you don't understand it, you won't be able to restore markets in neighborhoods, which is what will be necessary to repair this harm. So just briefly, if you look here, this is an example of a neighborhood where vacancy is at 40%. So 40% of the homes are vacant. And you see a traditionally distressed neighborhood, 600 total homes, about 40% is 223 abandoned houses. And you have to redevelop all of those in order to bring this price up. Why do you want to bring the price up? Well, if I'm a developer, and I'll love to hear Alex's reflection on this. If I'm a developer and I buy a house for $50,000 or even less, and it costs me $100,000 to renovate that home, and the house is only worth, say, $70,000 after I've put $100,000 into it, there's no incentive to do that. You're not going to get, you can't go to Home Depot and say, hey, I live in a racially distressed neighborhood, one that's been disinvested from for the past 20. So I would like that, material rate. No, they're going to say, this is the price of materials. This is what it costs. And so our argument is that the government created this problem. The government broke these neighborhoods, and the government has to be first in order to attract the private capital that will be necessary to fully restore neighborhoods in the city. So if I just move forward here, here's a map, a chart showing the relationship between vacancy on this side, vacancy rate. So this is up at 40% vacancy rate, you see over here, and the price point down here, as an example, is below $100,000. You have to bring the vacancy rate down and bring that price point up before private capital is going to be interested and able to enter into that neighborhood, even in a constructive way, to help restore the blight. So that's just the price point. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Alex, I would love it if you'd share your perspective as a developer who's in many neighborhoods like the ones we're talking about, and what it really takes to be able to address the problems at their roots.
Thank you, Pastor Andrew, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for inviting me this evening. It is a pleasure to be here with you all. I would be remiss. I see my father, Dr. Ben Aaron, on the call, so shouts out to him. Thank you for joining us, sir. Good to see you. And that PowerPoint sums it up, spot on. And I think when you think development, you have to know the history. You have to know, how did we get here, right? And Baltimore City, in my opinion, is a very unique city. It's often misunderstood. And I think its people sometimes are misunderstood. As a developer who's not from Baltimore, coming into this city that I fell in love with, I was even met with some resistance. I think some folks think developers are all rich and money hungry and, gentrifiers and all these things. But I can tell you, I did my research. And before I chose Baltimore, I looked at a map between Boston and Virginia. And in my opinion, Baltimore City was one of the last emerging markets on the East Coast. And I chose this city specifically because I've lived in places like DC and New York, and I've seen the development that has gone on there and the gentrification, we can use that word. And for me, it was important to be able to practice development without displacement. And the only way you can truly do that is if there is inventory. So while some look at this issue of vacancy and blight as a problem, my firm and I, we look at it as a thing of opportunity. If everybody in Baltimore City stays in their houses, right, and we just focus on the vacant and blight, primarily in East and West, we'll be able to change the narrative. We'll be able to welcome people back and fill those vacant properties. If you pick another city, most of it's developed. There's barely any vacant property, and there's probably barely any vacant land. So you're often fighting over each other, doing these gimmicks and tricks to do development in these areas, or even worse, displacing people, right? Maybe buying up a block or a smaller building, knocking it down and building, something larger at scale. So that's my selfish reason for being in Baltimore. It is challenging work. You have to roll up your sleeves. And I will tell you, Pastor Andrew, was spot on in giving the history and how we got here through the federal government and the poor practices. And as a result, I do think they have a responsibility to contribute and get this right. I can tell you in Baltimore City, it's going to take two things to really tackle this head on. One, it's going to take collaboration. This is not something one entity, one person, one investment group or developer can do on their own. It's going to take collaboration among for-profit and nonprofit entities, as well as the city getting involved to really move the needle and tackle this blight. And of course, it's going to take subsidy. In any other market, you should be able to secure debt financing from a bank and equity, investor dollars from investors. And debt and equity typically is your cap stack, and it can get a project done. Well, the problem in Baltimore is, again, where you have high vacancy, these properties have been vacant for at least 20, 30, 40 years. So we're not talking 3 months, as Pastor said, or, a couple years. You're talking decades long of vacancy. And what that does is not only affect the actual building itself, but even the underlying infrastructure, water, sewer lines, sidewalks, you name it. So if you're in a normal city where debt equity gets it done, you're able to buy a house, fix it up, and flip it, per se, for profit. In Baltimore, oftentimes the cost to repair these properties is more than you can sell or rent it for, leaving you with a gap. So we have champions like Senator Antonio Hayes, who's put forth, with the help of my colleagues, and drafted a bill that was passed, the appraisal gap. So for example, if I buy a house for X, I spend Y on renovating it, and then I list it, for example, for $250,000. Houses in that area might only be selling for $200,000 or $175,000. So we're really trying to be market makers and set the market. But as a result, there's a gap. And again, we don't want people to be underwater, as we say, and buy or pay for a house more than it's worth. So then you have these appraisal gap initiatives that step in and allow for a grant or subsidy to offset that cost. In addition, Governor Wes Moore recently passed an increase to the state revitalization programs, including Project CORE. Historically, Baltimore City on average received $15 million a year, which would go like that, in tackling projects. This year, and for the next, I think 10 years it is, or 15 years rather, you have a 50 million allocation, 50. So $50 million per year, specifically for Project Core to help tackle vacancy and blight. So again, those who have the capacity and the resources and the knowledge to purchase these properties and renovate them now can apply for subsidy for their projects through the state, and again, close that gap. So it's a big issue. It's something that's not going to be solved overnight. It's something that's going to take collaboration, and it's very complex and challenging work. Again, you're talking infrastructure, water, sewer, you're talking the project. And then you often have times where it's even hard for us as developers to even get some of the things we need. I can give you an example. I did a block project near Johns Hopkins Hospital on the east side, and I couldn't even get builder's risk insurance. When you develop these buildings, builder's risk protects you from theft or fire, and it's a requirement by most lenders or banks that you have this type of insurance. This is separate from like workers' comp or general liability if someone slips on the job or falls off the roof. And I remember putting together the financing for this block project and going to my agents and trying to get insurance, and they were like, no. Literally looked up the zip code, looked up whatever, and they were like, no. And it took one of my agents that I've been working with for years to fight. I think it was Erie Insurance, and we were able to get a policy. And again, we didn't have any issue, thankfully, on the project, and we successfully finished and turned it into homeownership. But those are kind of the challenges. I mean, permits, you name it, utility connections, things that are at our control, right? We don't control the utility companies and connection dates. We don't control insurance and policies. So it's much bigger than just, renovation and debt equity, as I mentioned. It takes a lot. And I'm excited to continue the work. We do both development for sale for home ownership. I'm a big proponent of promoting generational wealth creation through home ownership, particularly with a focus on the minority community. But we also realize that not everybody wants to buy or can afford to buy or is interested in buying. So we often renovate vacant multifamily, smaller boutique buildings and make them available for rent, and still put the same high quality fixtures and finishes that we would in something for sale, right? We believe everybody deserves high quality, safe and affordable housing. And if we have to get and apply for those subsidies to make it happen, so be it. So I really appreciate the time. I hope you all have learned something this evening. I hope we can count on you as a champion, even if it's your voice or participant in changing the narrative in Baltimore. So thank you.
Thanks, Alex. And I'd go take that exam. I'm concerned. We're after 7 o'clock.
All good.
Thank you for being here. Guy, do I have 2 or 3 more minutes maybe?
Sure, go ahead and take 2 or 3 more, and I'll just quickly, in case Alex has to jump off. Thank you, Alex. It's good to bring it home so that we know what's really happening in our homes and our neighborhoods. So thank you.
So just to reinforce, it's really important in any big project like this that we articulate and seek commitments from government entities, business entities, developers around some core redevelopment principles. These are ours for build, and I'm happy to say that the current mayor has agreed to these principles as a part of this work. Community-led redevelopment. We need to have communities who are in charge of their own redevelopment work, who are in charge of their own neighborhood plans. They know best what they need. And the people who have lived through the blight deserve the place at the table to be in charge of that redevelopment work. No displacement. I think no displacement to me is a better term than gentrification. I find sometimes that when people use the word gentrification, it's a very unspecific word. And we do want, as Alex said, we do want families, including Black families, to experience wealth acquisition over time. So we do want prices to move upward in markets over time for that wealth creation. What we do not want is for those prices to move up so quickly that people are displaced. And that's why I'm a big fan of the no displacement value. It's been part of the redevelopment work that Build has done on the east side, and it restores wealth to families that have lived through blight. Mixed income housing, Alex made reference to this too. We need to have affordability at lots of different levels. In some neighborhoods, we need to really attract people with greater wealth into those neighborhoods without displacing people who are already there. In other neighborhoods where prices are escalating quickly, we need to expand affordability. So it's about understanding the reality of a particular neighborhood and bringing the right tools to bear. And then right-sized housing to market demand. We all know that Baltimore was built for a city of 1 million people. We're under 600,000. We are not going to be a city of 1 million people. So we need to right-size communities as we go. And then finally, investing in whole blocks, not just houses. And that means thinking about what are the amenities that people need in neighborhoods, grocery stores, recreation centers, parks, places to play. So those are our core redevelopment principles. Now I'm just going to I'm going to actually zip through this to show you where we are. And Alex made reference to that. But as I flip through these slides, I just want you to see that this work takes what we call in community organizing persistent and consistent turnout by people. There is no way to pull something like this off in a show up one day event and expect the legacies of redlining and segregation to be ended once and for all. It requires that consistent kind of agitation that Guy made reference to at the beginning. And then in Annapolis, the bills that Alex referenced, this is what's actually was passed. And it's because people were in Annapolis, people from Build and other entities were in Annapolis every single week this session. So preserving this $50 million allocation for Project Core up from 15, enabling that to be able to be bonded, to be used as capital for bonding, which will create the possibility of $750 million over the next 15 years. We asked the governor for that. He delivered that. And allowing more flexibility for that funding to be used for different purposes. You heard Alex again give you some specifics of why that's so important. And then lastly, and this is unfortunately why I can't hang around with you all tonight, we have our mayoral accountability action tomorrow night. Folks are welcome to come. It's at St. Francis Academy at 501 East Chase Street tomorrow night, 6:30. And that's a time where we have the candidates commit to these kinds of community generated proposals so that we can hold them accountable to real transformative work for neighborhoods in the city. So with that, I'm going to stop. Thank you so much for the invitation to be here. I hope this has been helpful in your study and your work, and as you think about how we can continue to work together as a presbytery to right some wrongs and bring some repair to neighborhoods and neighbors that deserve it.
Thank you. Thank you, Andrew, and thank Alex again for us. You can tell that Andrew is a good organizer because he's working turnout right there to the end. And if any of you, especially those of you who live in Baltimore, but even if you don't live in Baltimore, if you are available to go put yourself in a seat, there's nothing that impresses politicians more than to see the room overfilled with people concerned about the issue. And this is also a time to remind you that, if you're not from Baltimore, the Baltimore Presbytery extends well beyond Baltimore. We have friends from National Capital here. We even have a friend from Indianapolis, or Indiana rather, not friend, but from Indiana. It's just good to remind you that Baltimore has this problem on steroids. We all have this problem in one way or another, and you can get involved in housing issues in your own community. We're working housing issues in Howard County right now and in Columbia. which was created largely to counteract redlining by Jim Rouse as his vision. And yet, all the years later, with Jim Rouse gone, we are fighting for affordable housing in downtown Columbia. So just a reminder that it's good to see what's happening in our city, Baltimore. Reminder, if you're not in Baltimore, it can be happening to you in one way or another. It probably is. So again, Andrew, thank you so much. I'm not going to bother going through the ground rules because you know them by now. And I think the groups are small enough that we have plenty of time for good and reasonable conversation. So with that, we have good questions for tonight. If I, well, actually, I can put those up in the chat real quick. I hope most of you had a chance to look at those questions. There is also background information to go along with the questions. If you haven't had a chance to read that, go back and do so. I am going to, as I'm talking, put those in the chat for right now. Of course, we will all be broken up into small groups. I hope that your group leaders can do them to some degree. Oh, great. Saying it's too long. Never mind. We will get them in one way or another. Your people will read them to you. Let's get into small groups. We've already taken up enough time. Let's talk about this stuff.
Hey. She said awesome job.
But she did things. Clothes and stuff. They've been out a long time.
Santa's just put them out.
Welcome back, everyone. If we could all mute our phones, please, or I mean, mute our there we go. Nice to, I was hearing somebody's dog in the background there. Oh, I see Sharice was able to join us. Welcome from Salt Lake City, Sharice. For those of you who were participating as group leaders and scribes and all that kind of stuff, as we've been doing, if you could hang around for about 15 minutes afterwards, just to talk a little bit and lessons learned. I will just remind you folks that next week is the last week. Anybody who came on late, please don't just read chapters 11 and 12. We have updated the website to encourage you to read the epilogue and even more importantly, read the frequently asked questions, the appendix. There's a lot of really important information in there. And Patsy and I learned the hard way when we taught this for our church, for just our church, like, whoa, that's you've got to read that part of the book. So Again, thank you folks for being here. I will close us in a word of prayer. Other than those of us who are helping with the leading, we just appreciate your being here, and we'll be freeing you up to go about your business. So if we could all assume a word of prayer. Gracious God, we go deeper and deeper each week. We learn more and more about the wounds that the dominant class, white America, has caused in our society. It's painful sometimes to hear about, but it's necessary to hear about. God, we must hear it if we are ever going to change it. And we thank you for opening our ears that we may hear, for opening our minds that we may accept and learn and continue to grow to be that better world that you're calling us to be that better society. Gracious God, send us out to our places of rest this evening. But as we said in our opening litany, the words of Isaiah, we will not grow weary, we will not faint. Lord, we know that you are calling us to do more. We ask that you bring us back next week with continued open minds, but also to really be thinking on and bringing into our hearts that question that Sharice and James gave to us just 3 weeks ago. We ask that you bring us back next week, ready to hear, ready to offer our own ideas, and ready to follow Jesus Christ, that itinerant, dark-skinned preacher who was a radical and who remains a radical because he is a radical demanding your justice. All of this we pray in his name. Amen.
Oh, well.
Good night, all.